Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Shane Beamer, the South Carolina Gamecocks, they have been one of the more fascinating programs to follow, monitor, and talk about as it comes to the recruiting trail in the 2026 cycle because you've seen a stark change and a stark difference in terms of how they're operating and how they're going about building their roster over the last couple of months, where you're probably looking at the smallest recruiting board that you see at the Power Four level. I don't think there's a Power Four program in the country that has cast a smaller net on the recruiting trail than Shane Beamer in South Carolina. Now, the caveat to that conversation is although the recruiting board is pretty dang small, the quality of player is pretty dang high. I mean, you even look at the commitments that South Carolina has in the fold, they're sitting 55th in the team rankings according to 24/7 Sports. The average player committed to South Carolina is a 91.18. That is higher than a team like Michigan that's in the top 10. That's higher than a team like Clemson that's in the top 10. That's higher than a team like Miami that's in the top 10. So although the quantity of commitments is a relatively small number, and I don't see South Carolina signing a super big class in 2026, the quality of football player that South Carolina is bringing in is pretty dang high. Now, how do you evaluate that decision by Shane Beamer to clearly, cast a smaller net? I'd say the pros here is that South Carolina has shown to be a program that's one of the best across the country at backfilling their roster in the transfer portal. And I think Shane Beamer saying, hey, instead of getting into all of these bidding wars at the high school ranks and bringing in 25, 30 guys at the high school ranks, let's focus a lot of time and resources at evaluating and allocating resources to players in the transfer portal. The thing that you can be pretty confident in is that the money's going to be well spent, because the advantage you have of building your roster, or building a chunk of your roster in the portal, is you get a pretty clear evaluation. I'm getting a guy that has shown over the last 2 to 3 years what they can do at the college football landscape versus allocating a lot of resources to a 17-year-old kid that we don't know what it's going to look like at the collegiate ranks. Now, the con here is I truly believe the upside of your program still resides at the high school ranks. And what I mean by that is, look, you ain't going to find a Dylan Stewart in the portal. You ain't going to find a Lenore Sellers. You ain't going to find a Josiah Thompson. You ain't going to find a Nick Eminari. Those true difference makers on Saturdays, those are guys that are recruited out of high school, because you don't see those kind of players very often hit the transfer portal. Now, I don't think South Carolina saying, hey, we don't want to try to access that upside, because they really are. The players that they're going after at the high school ranks are some of the more upside players that you see across the country. And so it's a very unique strategy that you're seeing from South Carolina. It's hard to argue that South Carolina hasn't been very successful building their roster. I mean, this is a team that you look at the roster that Shane Beamer took over to the roster that we saw in 2024 and the roster we're about to see in 2025. The roster has gotten better. It's a very intriguing conversation to have. The other thing I'll note is that, okay, am I okay with, at certain positions, allocating resources to transfer portal guys? Yes, absolutely. The one position I don't think you can do that on is line of scrimmage, both on the offensive line and defensive line. It's going to be hard, nearly impossible, to find high-end SEC caliber tackles in the transfer portal. It's going to be really hard. We saw South Carolina struggle to bring in those big bodies in the middle of the defensive line as well. Well, you look at South Carolina's class in 2026 and say, well, out of the 10 commitments, 5 of them are line of scrimmage players. 4 of them are blue chip caliber guys. So although it's not going to be a massive class, it's going to be focused on line of scrimmage players, because we know those are the positions that are harder to address in the transfer portal. Look, if you want to bring in a running back, or you want to go out and grab a cornerback or a wide receiver, there's plenty of talent to go around in the transfer portal. Going to be dang hard to find a tackle. It's going to be dang hard to find a guy like Dylan Stewart that's available in the portal. And so you're seeing South Carolina really value those kind of players at those kind of positions at the high school ranks. Now, before we get into the decisions coming up to the South Carolina fans, look, if you're watching this episode in the middle of July, and I hope I did my best to articulate at least the way I'm viewing South Carolina's roster building strategy, would love to hear how you guys feel about it. It's a little bit different than what we're used to. In college football has changed so much in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, it was pretty clear the strategy that you could build your roster. Now with revenue share, NIL, the transfer portal, a lot of different ways to go about building your roster. And it seems like South Carolina is making some tweaks to how they want to go about building their roster. Would love to hear your feedback in the comment section, your thoughts and opinions. The way that South Carolina has used the portal and the way they've proven to us that they can evaluate and hit in the portal makes me kind of okay with how South Carolina is going about their business. Would love to hear from you guys. Appreciate y'all rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And I want to get into who are the most important players set to make decisions over the next 2 weeks. Because I want to be very clear that although I am praising South Carolina's ability to build a good chunk of their roster and find really quality players in the transfer portal, at the end of the day, recruiting the high school ranks is still very, very important. I'm a little less concerned about the recruiting ranking, but I'm more concerned with the quality of player you're bringing in, because the real difference makers you're going to find them at the high school ranks. Number one, it ain't even close, Landon Duckworth. Now, July 18th decision date. I think a lot of South Carolina fans wished that this one was wrapped up about now. I don't think anything's changed. It's coming down to South Carolina and Auburn. At least that's the last we've heard. And Auburn just took a quarterback. It sounds like South Carolina is the team that is primed to land the commitment. You want to get Landon Duckworth in the fold as soon as possible, because when you have that face of your class, the gravitational pull of an elite quarterback, it's strong. You see when teams land those elite quarterbacks, it all of a sudden seems like other players kind of gravitate towards that. So the quicker we get Landon Duckworth in the fold, one, just a really good quarterback, and y'all know how I feel about him. We talked about him a lot. But number two, that gravitational pull, that momentum that the Landon Duckworth commitment could give South Carolina feels really, really important. Number two, I'm going to go with JB Shabbaz. This kid freaking, I think he rocks. And I think, is he the best offensive tackle currently at the high school ranks? No. Do I think there's some work to be done? Yes. Do I think he's as day one ready as a guy like Josiah Thompson? No, I don't. This kid looks like how you want an SEC tackle to look. He's 6'7", he's 300 pounds, has a very, very lean frame. He carries what I mean by that is he carries the weight well. There's not a lot of sloppy, bad weight on the frame. Basketball background, good functional athleticism for that size, and a really powerful kid. I think there's a lot technically that needs to get cleaned up in JB Shabbaz's game, but I think the upside is absolutely monster with this kid. You land JB Shabbaz, here's the benefit that you get if you're a South Carolina fan. He does not need to be thrown out on the football field year one, year two. The tricky thing is with Josiah Thompson, they needed him to play year one. With JB Shabbaz coming in and the depth that South Carolina has built on the offensive line, you're not going to need to thrust this kid out like you've had in the past with Josiah Thompson and Tree. You can get him into the program, develop him for a year or two. You could be looking at an all SEC tackle. And that's one of the things I appreciate the most. South Carolina's done a nice job stacking really quality bodies within this program on the offensive line. To me, he's that number two guy. He's committing July 11th. Ohio State, Tennessee, South Carolina. That's one of the things I'll point out. Although South Carolina has had some, what I would say, frustrating misses on the recruiting trail, it's very clear the pull that South Carolina has. I mean, they've been in it for some guys like PJ Dean probably is the biggest example. They've been in it for some guys that 5 years ago, South Carolina's probably not even getting a hat on the table. And now it's very clear that South Carolina is legit contenders for some of the best players across the country. Number 3 on the list, Samari Matthews. Now, it's not necessarily at a position of dire need. It's not necessarily a position that's really difficult to address in the portal, but it is a player that I think's an absolute dude. He's one of the cleanest projections at the high school ranks, and that's something that very clear South Carolina is thinking about. Hey, if we are going to go out and get aggressive for a 17-year-old kid at the high school ranks, we want to feel really confident that they're going to pan out and hit. There's not many cornerbacks in the 2026 class that I feel more confident in than a guy like Samari Matthews. And this ain't me getting up here and going to list off some crazy track and field times and some crazy height, weight, speed metrics. Long athlete, very smooth dude. You turn on the film and say, one of the best cornerbacks at the high school ranks pretty comfortably. He's number 3. Now I'm going to go to Marion Watkins, number 4. Safety linebacker hybrid. It sounds like this one's coming down to South Carolina and Texas A&M, with Texas A&M building some real momentum as of late. I don't think Shane Beamer is going to let this one go very easily. And I think South Carolina is very comfortable. Hey, whatever position you want to play, we go and bet on the athlete that Tamarian Watkins is. So you got in the next 2 weeks, really some of the bigger names and more important names to South Carolina set to come off the board. Darius Gray, outside of Landon Duckworth, is probably the next most important. He's a guy that we don't really know when he's going to commit, but we do know that South Carolina is in the thick of it for Darius Gray services. Big decisions coming up. We'll have the South Carolina commitment sweatshirt at the ready. Feels like a big next couple of weeks for South Carolina on the recruiting trail, and I'm kind of interested to see how this works out for South Carolina. It's a very interesting roster building strategy, but if there's one thing that should give South Carolina fans confidence in is Shane Beamer's done a really nice job with this roster. 5 years ago, South Carolina did not have a roster that I thought could compete at the highest level of the SEC. They had that kind of roster in 2024. I think they're going to have that kind of roster in 2025. Kind of just trusting the process here with Shane Beamer in South Carolina. We'll close it out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.